It's such an honor to be here. And I have to say, first and foremost, I'm a practitioner and not so much a speaker, so bear with me. Today I want to share with you some of the lessons I've learned in the past 20 plus years that I've been working as a mediator for the Victim Offender Mediation Dialogue Program, or VOMD. VOMD is a restorative justice process. Later this afternoon, I'll be doing a workshop on circles, which is also a restorative justice process. And a central theme of what I'm going to share now and this afternoon is that we need to start looking and learning how to view the world through a restorative justice lens. Reconciliation and restoration are brother and sisters from the same family, and how we view this world shapes how we engage in this work and with others. So, like I said, I'll share more about restorative justice and this restorative lens this afternoon, but I have two goals for our time here this morning. Let's see if this works. Yep. One is to provide insight on how to live the life as a reconciler and do the work well. The second goal is to gain insight on how to live your life as a reconciler in your personal journey of everyday life. The first is about doing the work, and the second is about living it out. And to do this, I am going to share a dream that I had and tell the story of three mothers. So I'm going to start by telling you about my dream that I had several years back. It's not a complicated dream. In fact, it's pretty simple. But oddly enough, this dream was one that had a huge impact on my life. So in my dream, I saw myself sleeping. I don't know how I knew I was asleep. I was asleep seeing myself sleeping. So I was sleeping and I heard God whisper to me, "Cheryl, remember the word quantum." And somehow I knew that God wanted me to remember that word when I woke up. And so I started repeating the word over and over in my dream. Quantum, 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 quantum. Because if I repeated it, I was sure I would remember it when I woke up. Then in my dream, I fell back asleep again, not repeating the word. A little while later, I heard God whisper again, "Cheryl, remember the word fluid." I was like, okay. And I instinctively knew that fluid meant like a liquid, and so I started repeating it. Fluid, 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 and I'd be quantum, quantum, quantum. And then all of a sudden I fell back asleep, and I wasn't repeating the words. A little while later, I heard God whisper one more time, "Cheryl, remember the word circles." I was like, okay. Circles, 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 fluid, 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 quantum, quantum, and I fell back asleep. Right before I woke up, and I don't know how I knew I was about to wake up, but right before I woke up, I realized I had stopped repeating the words. So in a frantic state, I was like, what were the words? Quantum, quantum, fluid, fluid. What was the third word? I couldn't remember the third word. I could only remember quantum and fluid. And then in the moment I woke up, the word came to my mind, circles. That's the dream. I don't know about you, but I have just crazy dreams from time to time, and most of them are silly and don't mean anything, but I knew this dream was important. There was something about it that I knew, even though I didn't understand it, I knew it was very important. So I wrote down the three words, quantum, fluid, and circles, and I went about my day. That morning, the morning after I woke up from the dream, I was actually going to meet with two victims who lost their daughter when she was killed by a drunk driver. As I was driving to that meeting, I was still thinking about the dream. So I called my son, who was a college student at the time. He's kind of a brainiac. And I asked him what quantum meant, because I didn't know what the word meant. He explained that it's a term that was plural for the word quanta. I didn't know what that meant either. I was like, thanks a lot. But the definition of a quanta is basically the minimum amount of any physical entity. So in other words, it's something very, very tiny. He explained that it's a physics term, but he had no idea what the dream meant. And since it was physics, I called my niece, who happens to be a high school physics teacher, and I asked her about it. And she didn't know what it meant either. And she did explain to me that She did tell me the same definition of quantum that my son did. So she didn't know what it meant, so we hung up and I just kept driving. And about 30 minutes later, my niece calls me back and she said, Aunt Cheryl, you are not gonna believe this, but there's actually something that's called quantum fluid circles. It's a real thing. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. And since then, I've had the opportunity to visit with some people who are much smarter than I will ever be. One such physics professor gave me some incredible insights into the science behind quantum fluid circles. So now, you're gonna get a physics lesson. Sit back and enjoy, and I know it's just what you wanted in the morning. And I really have to have my notes here on this because it's more complicated than sometimes my brain understands. As I said, a quanta is this very tiny small particle, and it can be combined with other particles. Quantum fluids are an example of these little combined quantas. They are liquids that are found at the very low temperature of absolute zero. When I say low temperature and zero, I'm not talking about the zero that we know, which is 32 degrees below freezing, or the lowest temperature that was ever recorded on Earth, which is in Antarctica of negative 144 degrees. But quantum fluids occur at absolute zero, which is negative 271 degrees Fahrenheit. So temperature is determined, I told you this was a physics lesson. Temperature is determined by movement, so the colder it gets, the less movement there is. Water flows and moves easily at room temperature, but when it is exposed to cold, it freezes and stops moving, as it did at room temperature. So theoretically, absolute zero would be a place of nothingness. No movement, nothing happening. And the theory is when fluids, these quantum fluids, are exposed to temperatures at almost absolute zero, a change occurs when another principle is introduced. That second principle is the presence of turbulence, which is caused by a disturbance. Turbulence isn't something that we just experience on planes or bumpy flights. Turbulence is around us. It's in the air right now where we are. It's in the blood that flows through our veins. There we go. Turbulence is in a vortex or it's spinning. Examples of turbulence are what you see here: galaxies, hurricanes, tornadoes, wingtip vortices coming off of planes. Even the air coming off of butterfly wings does so in a vortex. Vortices in ordinary fluids can be weak or strong, big or small. So turbulence would not exist at absolute zero, because remember, there's no movement at absolute zero, but it would still be present at temperatures near absolute zero. Are you following me so far? Or have I lost you? So quantum fluids are these special fluids which exist only at a very low temperature near absolute zero, which have undergone a phase transition. Disturbance occurs and it causes it to spin in a vortex. So the fluid is now spinning. Where did I go? What is amazing is that unlike classical vortices like tornadoes and stuff, the strength in the core structure, the center of the quantum fluid's spinning, is fixed. So the flow that spins around that axis is considered a superflow because it doesn't decay. In simple terms, quantum fluid circles, they don't lose energy as they flow. All other vortices in nature, like hurricanes, tornadoes, they all eventually dissipate and go away. Quantum fluids do not. This is considered superfluidity because it never dies. When they discovered it, it defied already existing laws of nature based on regular physics. The laws that it defied is that everything, one of them is that everything eventually stops, and that second is everything dies. You roll a ball and eventually it'll stop rolling. And everything on this earth is slowly decaying and dying. It's kind of depressing, but it's the truth. But quantum fluid circles are in a category of quantum physics, not regular physics. And quantum fluid circles never lose energy, and therefore they never die and never stop, which is mind-boggling to physicists. Me too, but them even more so. So, what does all this dream mean? Why am I giving you this physics lesson? What does this have to do with reconciliation? What does it have to do with peacemaking? I knew that God didn't give me that dream because I was supposed to learn physics. And so I began asking him, what does this dream mean, God? How does this translate into my everyday life? And when I started thinking on it, several themes emerged, and these are the things that I've learned. The first is the idea that quantum fluid circles start with the tiniest of all material, a quanta. And when that quanta particle is joined with another quanta, a fluid is created. So these are really tiny things, but we live in a world where bigness is often celebrated. The bigger the church, the bigger the ministry, the bigger the numbers, that's where we tend to give our values. And that's not bad in and of itself, because after all, our God is a very big God. But God also works in the small spaces. In fact, it's often in the small places that God reveals some of his greatest miracles. Bethlehem was not an urban setting. It was very small. Most of us work in small churches and in small ministries. Some of us are from small communities. A few years back, I was with a friend and we were talking to a leader of a national organization, and he asked me what I did for a living, and I half apologetically said, I'm just from a small community working at a small nonprofit. And later my friends afterwards said to me, you need to stop apologizing for being small. Great things come out of small spaces. You may be small, but you're doing amazing work. And I realized then she was absolutely right. I began embracing small opportunities and small moments, knowing that they would become a part of a greater whole. And in doing so, I began to see many miracles and destinies emerge out of those small spaces. The second thing I learned about quantum fluids is the fact that they exist near absolute zero. That is the coldest, most barren place where this change occurs that otherwise would never occur. How does that translate into our ordinary life? The truth is that each of us is going to experience this reality at least once in our lifetime. And I don't mean you're going to be really cold and go to Antarctica, but we will find ourselves in emotionally, spiritually cold, barren, frozen places. No one likes to be in isolated spaces, alone, scared, and frozen. But it's that space that's required for the phenomenal transformation to happen in quantum fluid circles. Like I said, most of us don't tend to like these times in our lives when we feel alone or abandoned or destitute, but cold, barren spaces can become birthing centers. There's no place these themes are more evident. Well, excuse me, let me back up. The final lesson that I learned from this dream is that for quantum fluid circles to occur, there has to be some kind of disturbance. Most of it, how many of you love having disturbances? Most of us don't. And we spend a lot of our time trying to keep things flowing smoothly, and we become quite annoyed with disturbances. But it's these very disturbances that are introduced that oftentimes can move us into something greater, force us into something profound. Without disturbance, the phenomenon of quantum fluid circles will not occur. So disturbances can actually launch miracles. There's no place these themes are more evident than with victims of violent crime and their offenders. Violent crime is the most horrific experience the human spirit can endure. You can't get a lonelier, more desolate, cold, frozen space than the days after a violent crime. So many victims have shared about how after the days after the crime they felt numb, disoriented, often frozen, not even able to get out of bed. And that sounds like near zero to me. So when talking about the dream and to see how all this connects to the peacemaking reconciliation stuff, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the work that I do as a mediator through the Victim Offender Mediation Dialogue Program and how that program actually works, and I'll come back to the dream and tie it all together. The VOMD program is actually through the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, through the Victim Services Division, so it's a state-funded program. It's victim-initiated. The victim of a violent crime has to call Victim Services to start the process. Once that's done, the case is assigned to a mediator. The mediator sets up the meeting with the victim to explain the process, to find out what are the goals of the victim for the meeting and with their offender. After that, the mediator goes to visit the offender in prison to see if they're willing to participate. So the process is voluntary for everybody involved. If the offender agrees to participate, the next critical step is the offender must take full responsibility for the crime. If they don't take responsibility for the crime, the case is closed. That's the end of the process. If they do take responsibility, then the mediator has 3 or 4 meetings once a month separately with the victim and the offender. Preparation is crucial for the mediation process. The goal is, as the mediators, to provide a safe place for that dialogue to happen. Once the preparation is complete and the mediator feels that the process would be beneficial, the mediation is scheduled. It's important to note that preparation is vital in this process. It's the very thing that sets up the opportunity to fulfill justice. I think it's interesting when we talk about justice or fulfilling justice, what that looks like. Because in this case, all the offenders have already been sentenced for the crime they've committed. So according to the law, justice has been completed or justice has been served. But if justice had been served by the law, if justice could be served solely on the law, I would not be on case number 2,821 of victim offender mediations. The VOMD process can and does bring about the ultimate fulfillment of justice for victims. After the mediation, after the actual meeting, we do a quick debriefing, and then finally, a month later, go back to check on both parties and then close the case. Before I go on, I want to kind of circle back to the concept of accountability or taking responsibility for harms. Accountability is vital for reconciliation. Without accountability, true reconciliation cannot occur. We can forgive someone even if they never take responsibility for the harms they've done. We can even continue to be in relationship with someone if they don't take responsibility for the harm. But true reconciliation will not have occurred there because there will always be the reality that the other person would not own up to what they did. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. They belong to each other. It's kind of like the expression, all poodles are dogs, but not all dogs are poodles. I think I got that right. We can experience forgiveness in a situation and not have that relationship reconciled. If a friend hurts me and walks away, I can forgive them, but reconciliation has not occurred. But reconciliation requires forgiveness. Forgiveness in order to maintain that relationship. That's why accountability is so important. This concept of accountability as a requirement for reconciliation is not the world according to Cheryl Miller or even the VOMD program. Acts 3:19 says, repent then and turn to God so that your sins may be wiped out and that times of refreshing may come from the Lord. We have to first acknowledge our sin and repent before we can be reconciled with God. In VOMD, the lack of accountability creates an opportunity for that offender to inflict future harm on the victim. In life, it's the same thing. The lack of accountability can create the opportunity for future harm. Denial of harm is simply another form of harm. The lack of accountability is the absolute greatest obstacle to reconciliation. My role as a mediator is to prepare both parties, and the most important tool I use to do that is active listening. Listening is the single most important element in peacemaking. And not just listening, but active listening. In fact, 7 times in the Gospels, Jesus tells us anyone who has ears to hear should listen and understand. But I do have to say, from the work that I do training people in restorative justice, I have found that most people are not very good listeners. But that can change. We can learn. In fact, you can be trained. So now I want to shift gears and tell you the stories of three mothers that kind of symbolize all that I've been talking about. Two of the stories are about mediations that I've done, and I always change the details of what actually happened and the names to protect the confidentiality of the parties, but the message and the results are the same. One of the very first cases that I was assigned was a woman whose youngest son was murdered 10 years earlier. I'll call her Claire. Her goal for the mediation was that she needed answers. She was desperate to know the last details and the last moments of her son's life. There were two people involved and charged with the murder. One was convicted and was sentenced to life in prison. The second was also convicted and sentenced to 5 years probation. Let that sink in. So I go to meet with the offender who was sentenced to probation. I'll call him Frank. While he was on probation, he was picked up on a new drug charge and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. And that charge revoked his original probation, so he was required to serve out the remaining 5 years. He was up for parole in a year, so we wanted to meet with him first. He agrees to participate and takes full responsibility for the crime. So I go to meet with him and I ask him, tell me what happened that night. With absolutely no emotions whatsoever, he shares this story. They had been partying with the son, and somewhere in the night, they decided they wanted to steal his truck. He had a really nice truck. So when the bar closed, they convinced him to join him at a local park to party more down by the lake. So he goes with them, and after a little while, the offender who got life in prison snuck off to his car, got a bat out of his car, came back and hit the son in the back. As the young man was falling, he continued to beat him with the bat. The offender that we were meeting with kicked him in the head, in the face, and the body repeatedly until they killed him. When they were finished, they tied him to the back of the truck, drug his body to the edge of the lake, and threw him in to dispose of him. But when they threw him in, the water must have startled him, and he wasn't dead. He started thrashing around in the water. And so the two offenders jump in the water, grab him, and pull him out. The one who got life in prison shot him in the chest, and they threw him back in. That was the story that I heard. I walked out of that prison and thought, how in the world do I bring a mother here to hear these gruesome details? But as soon as I had that thought, I knew it was not my right to decide. So we proceeded and the mediation was scheduled. The victim had written down all the questions that she had for her offender, and the list was long. In fact, she filled up 4 pages of a legal pad, every line with a question that she had for the offender. So I knew it was going to be a long day. We set the whole day aside for the mediation. The mediation starts, and she asks him to tell her what happened that night, and she sat very stoic and listened to every word. Then she began to ask her questions. And some of the questions were questions like, did he know he was dying? Was he scared? Did he cry out for me? And sadly, the answer to all 3 of those questions was yes. After about an hour and a half, the victim looked at me and said, okay, I am finished, I'm ready to go. And I was shocked. She had 4 pages of questions. And I was new at the process. This was my second mediation. And my first thought was, boy, I've screwed up. I didn't create a space where she felt safe to continue. I asked her if she was sure, and she said, yeah, I'm sure. And finally I asked her to review all her questions again, because this was her one shot. She wasn't going to get another chance, and I didn't want her to miss anything. So she did. She slowly read through all of the questions, and she reaffirmed she was ready to go. So we wrapped up our time together, went through the debriefing, and we left the prison. And I was so disappointed. I called her the next day to check on her, which is a part of the process. I asked her how she was feeling now that it was over. And she said, I don't know, really. I've been thinking about it all day. She said, I guess the best way to describe it would be that for the past 10 years, it felt like there's been this giant boulder sitting on my chest, slowly crushing the life out of me, slowly crushing the breath out of me, and now it's gone. I can breathe again and I can live again. I was floored. I was on the phone, I was like, what? Were we in the same room? I didn't see anything that profound happening in that space, but that didn't mean nothing had occurred. In an hour and a half, the length of that mediation, her life had completely changed. She went from suffocating and dying to breathing and living. In the span of our lifetime, an hour and a half is very tiny. So one of the things that I realized is that dramatic changes can come in very tiny moments. Claire's story is a beautiful example of how I see work as a peacemaker. Our role as reconcilers, and I've used this term so many times before, is to be boulder movers. And the harsh reality, boulders are hard to move. But oh, the hope when they're just found when they are. I love this scripture in Isaiah. Go out, go through the gates, prepare the highway for my people to return, smooth out the road, and pull out the boulders. I love even more that that's the exact language that Claire used, that this boulder was gone. That's our job as peacemakers. And going back to my dream, that day of the mediation, she intentionally entered a cold, barren space, both stepping into a prison, which is a very cold space, but also stepping back into the story, the brutal story of her son's murder. And in that space, she encountered disturbances with every detail that she heard. But in doing so, it set something into motion, otherwise that would never have occurred, and she walked away with a miracle of new life. I have to add, when she and I met for the last time, she told me she was sitting in church the following Sunday, and she looked up at the cross and she said, it's time to put my son on the cross. I need to close this chapter of my life. She also told me, I'm not ready to forgive Frank. I told her I completely understand. One of the most important lessons I've learned working with victims like Claire is that forgiveness cannot be demanded, it has to be discovered. So many victims have shared stories about how friends and families have told them, you need to forgive. And I've even heard stories from them, horror stories in some situations where their pastors and fellow church members demanded they forgive and used scripture to guilt them. Over and over, victims have said things like, I know I should, but I just can't. I'm just not ready. Personally, I believe Claire will eventually come to a place to forgive Frank, because I saw her deep faith, and I trust my God will gently lead her to that reality. Reconciliation was not a focus of that mediation. Claire and Frank never knew each other before the crime, so there was no need to be reconciled, or would it have been even been appropriate in that situation for them to be reconciled. Forgiveness didn't occur either. But that didn't stop that mediated process from being one of peacemaking and bringing profound healing. The second story I want to share is another mother. I'm going to call her Alicia. Her only son was murdered. Her only child was murdered. This case was a case of a drug deal gone bad. The offender in the case was he was young and a member of a prison gang. The victim's son was not in a gang. In fact, he was a college student that was buying drugs from the offender without even knowing he was in a gang. But there was a problem with the money, and the offender, who I will call Michael, was told by other gang members that he needed to take care of this situation, which meant he needed to kill him, and he did. Obviously, Michael was caught, he was charged, he went to prison, and was to do his time in what's called administrative segregation, or ADSEG, or SEG for short, which is the high security prison inside of prison. If you're a confirmed member of a prison gang, you'll most likely do your time in ADSEG. Inmates in SEG spend 23 out of 24 hours in their cell alone. They only come out to exercise or shower. And the only way out of SEG is to go through a program to denounce your prison gang, and Michael was not going to do that. So he was going to serve his sentence in SEG. He agrees to participate in the mediation after getting permission from his gang bosses. He had to get permission, and he was willing to take full responsibility. And like Frank, when I spoke with him, he showed no emotion at all. In fact, he was even more callous than Frank because he told me if his gang ordered him to murder again, he would do it. Alicia was a woman of deep faith, but she was different from Claire. She had forgiven Michael from the very beginning. I'm not going to go into much details about the crime, but I do want to share about some very powerful moments in the actual mediation itself. After months of preparation, we set up the mediation. Because Michael was in SEG, we couldn't have a face-to-face meeting like we normally do. We normally sit in visitation. We're at a table, and the victim and the offender are like 2 feet apart from each other. But because he was in SEG, we had to do the mediation in the legal booth. Legal booths are for confidential attorney visits, and they're the size of a small closet. They look like this picture. So we start the process, and Alicia begins by asking questions. Michael answers all her questions and tells her what happened, and about an hour into the process, Alicia says, "I think you need to ask me for forgiveness." Michael didn't respond to her request. He just kept talking about details of the crime in an attempt to change the conversation. Alicia answered his questions, appeared to let it go, but I thought it was so strange that she was even asking him that question. She had told me many times that she had forgiven Michael. During the victim impact statement she read at sentencing, she said she forgave Michael. And even this morning in the mediation, she had reminded him of that she had forgiven him. But here, oddly, in this cramped, awkward space, she was requesting he ask her for forgiveness. After about 10 minutes, she said it again. "I think you need to ask me for forgiveness." Alicia was sitting on the little stool, because it's just a little round stool that's welded to the floor, and I was sitting in a chair behind her. My chair had to be turned sideways behind her because the space was so cramped. So I was between her and the door that was locking us in. So I couldn't see Alicia's face, but I could see Michael's. When she repeated the statement a second time, it was the first time I saw any hint of emotion. He dropped his eyes for a second and he whispered, "I don't think I have the right." And then he changed the subject again and began talking about details of the crime again. And Alicia followed the questions. She asked more questions. He gave her more answers. Finally, a third time, Alicia said, "I think you need to ask me for forgiveness. I really think you need to ask me for forgiveness." Realizing she was not going to let it go, Michael lowered his head. It was probably only about a few seconds he sat that way, but it seemed like hours. Eventually, he took a deep breath and he croaked out the words, "Will you forgive me?" And immediately she said yes. I watched this strong, hard-faced young man absolutely melt. Tears burst from his eyes. Huge tears flooded down his cheeks. They fell into pools on the table under his chin. It was dripping off his nose. His body heaved spastically from the sobbing. He sat there like that for a few minutes and finally regained some semblance of composure, and they spoke gently for the remaining minutes. When it came time to leave, they both stood up, and as a parting gesture, Alicia placed her hand on the glass, on that cold glass, and Michael put his hand on the other side, touching hers. And they stood there together and wept. We left. Eventually, we had to step out of that space. And afterwards, I asked Alicia, what was the purpose of her request to him to ask for forgiveness, notably in the light that she had already given him. And she said, "Oh, I didn't do that for me. I did that for him." I followed by asking her what was it she was feeling that moved her to make that request. And timidly she said, "I think it might have been love. Does that make me weird?" And I responded to her question by saying that what I witnessed was probably the most beautiful demonstration of what it means to love our enemies. Here was the woman who had experienced the most horrific ordeal in the murder of her only child. She had every right to hate Michael, but she didn't. She acted in love. I realized that day, if she could do that for Michael, I have no excuses to withhold forgiveness in situations that I encounter on a daily basis. I realized that reconciliation and forgiveness starts with me. Her story didn't change how I practice reconciliation or how I practice the process, but it did change how I live my life as a reconciler. The lesson I learned was about my own need to see the humanity in all people, including those who have betrayed me and wounded me deeply. Seeing the two of them connecting hands, even if it was through glass, I knew I was witnessing something sacred. I was seeing reconciliation in its truest form. I was seeing the gospel played out in human flesh. If there was ever a person who had the right to declare Michael's guilty of his sins and pay for that sin with his life, it would have been Alicia. She had every right. But Alicia knew Christ, and like him, she surrendered her right to condemn him and instead offered him forgiveness. Not only did she forgive him, but she went even further to walk him through the process of forgiveness out of love. You can't get a situation of greater possible enemies than a woman whose son was murdered and the man who did it. But she didn't see him as an enemy. She saw the humanity in him. She saw his need for forgiveness, and she loved him. I have one last story to tell. This story is not about mediation. This one's a little harder for me to tell. I hope I can get through it. This is more personal. This is my own story. And this is not about reconciliation. This is about how those processes affected how I live out my life. Most of you in this room will never facilitate a process like I do between victims of severe violent crime and their offenders. And most of you will not facilitate peacemaking with conflicts even as close to this severe and extreme. But you will all experience challenging and traumatic times. And when you do, I hope the concepts and the lessons that I've shared here today will help create a roadmap on how to navigate those cold, lonely, frozen spaces, which happened to me on February in 2016 when my oldest son, Travis, was involved in a motorcycle wreck. At that time, he was a pilot in the United States Air Force stationed in Las Vegas. I didn't know it then, but I would come to understand that hard spaces like a hospital ICUs can become a birthing center. I'm going to give you a warning. That picture is the actual motorcycle that my son. That's the picture of the scene. I'm going to give you a warning. I'm about to put a picture up of what Travis looked like in the hospital the day after his wreck when we arrived. It's a hard picture to see, so if you don't want to see it, I'm only going to leave it up for a few minutes. So if you don't want to see it, close your eyes. This is what Travis looked like. When we walked into the hospital room on February 12th. Okay. I can't see it. Is the picture gone? Okay. So yeah, if you had your eyes closed, you can open them. I'll tell you about Travis's injuries. Travis had 4 skull fractures, both the temporal lobe fractures and the both basal skull fractures. He had a traumatic brain injury. His jaw was separated from his skull. His right eye orbital socket and cheekbones were shattered. He had a broken clavicle, a broken sternum, and a broken leg. We found out later that he was given less than 1% chance of living. At that time, he was single, so I ended up having to stay with him for the 2 months during his recovery in the hospital and rehab. The next few weeks and months were agonizing and terrifying. I was trying to navigate this process of helping my son recover, and I was so afraid, but I was also angry. I was really angry at my husband. He had always had motorcycles. He raced motorcycles, and so both my sons grew up wanting to ride, and I wanted to blame my husband. But that's not what I was most angry about. I was really mad because after 3 days at the hospital, we flew out there together. After 3 days at the hospital, he left to go back to work. And in my mind, I knew that he needed to work, but my heart screamed that he needed to be with me and with our son. My life and my work had been interrupted for 2 months. He left me there alone to navigate the horrible ups and downs of severe injuries, future surgeries, not knowing if I would ever see my son again. On the hard nights, I would call him and rage about how unfair this was. Then, one particularly bad night, I thought about the victims who would have given anything to have the hope that their child might survive. Mothers who lost children who would have eagerly traded a graveside visit for a less than 1% chance of hope. I had seen God move in spaces with victims in those mediation rooms, so I knew what he could do. So I called out to that God of miracles and said, if you can do that there, you can do that here in my absolute zero. I thought about the victims who had forgiven their offenders. My husband hadn't done anything as horrible as what they had experienced. So I knew I had to forgive. And I knew I had to be thankful that my son's story wasn't over. And from then on, it changed how I interacted with everybody, with my family, with Travis in his recovery, and with anyone who came into the room or contact with us. And the hope that I experienced once I made that decision was profound. Nothing had changed. He was still the same man given less than 1% chance of recovery, but that tiny quanta of hope was all I needed. There was disturbance after disturbance after disturbance in that recovery process, but we persevered. Don't get me wrong, I had great hope, but that didn't make it any less difficult. The reality is that time was extremely challenging, and there were some very, very dark nights. But like my dream, it was in that cold, frozen, barren space, a place where no hope should be found, it was. And that gave birth to something phenomenal. In that cold space, disturbance entered and set into motion the miraculous. Let me show you how. You remember the picture that I showed of what Travis looked like the morning of his wreck? On that first picture with him standing with a horse was what Travis looked like 1 month after the wreck. 1 month. The second picture on April 14th was what Travis looked like 2 months after the wreck when he returned to work. The one on the bottom with Travis on the horse is 4 months later when he was riding his horse Indy at a weekend rodeo. A year later, he met and eventually married his wife. 2 years ago, my grandson Charlie was born. And if you think about it, Charlie really only had a less than 1% chance of ever being born. He's our miracle grandbaby. At that time, we didn't know if he was going to be allowed to remain on active duty in the Air Force because of the significance of his injuries, particularly the traumatic brain injury and the possible long-term effects. So 4 years ago, Travis fought and petitioned the medical board to allow him to remain in the Air Force, and it was approved. And finally, a month ago, after 6 years of not being allowed to fly, we found out that he was medically cleared to fly again. So Major Travis Miller today is completely healed, and he's once again a pilot in the United States Air Force. And they're expecting a little girl in August. Miracle after miracle after miracle. The miracles have been unstoppable. So, in closing, there are 5 things I hope you take away from today and the lessons that I've learned. Sorry. To do this work well and to truly be peacemakers in our communities, we must begin to learn how to view the world through a restorative justice lens. Come to my workshop later, you can learn more about what that looks like. The second thing I hope you learned was that small things matter. Don't wonder if any small thing can make a difference. Not only can it, but sometimes it's the only thing that does. In an hour and a half, a victim's life was reborn. Travis was given a less than 1% chance. You can't get any smaller. But it was enough to hope, enough to press in and wait to see the miraculous. You may just be one person doing many small things, but you have no idea how your actions may create crazy, amazing miracles in the future. Hard spaces can be birthing centers. So learn how to appreciate and thrive when you find yourself in that space. And not only appreciate them, but then also be willing to enter into those spaces with others. When the pressure increases, stay present, lean in, knowing that in that context, new things may emerge. Stay the course when it gets tough. Number 4, disturbances can launch miracles. Don't fret the disturbances. Learn how to use them to create something incredible, profound, and unstoppable. And finally, reconciliation starts with me and with you. Where are you on your personal journey? Are you living your life like the Alicias of the world? Are you quick to forgive those who hurt you? Or even better, have you learned to love them? I'm willing to bet there's at least 1 or 2 people in this room who are going to leave this space knowing a phone call or a meeting is long overdue. So I hope these lessons help you do the work as a reconciler, but also live out this life as a reconciler. None of it's easy, and rarely is it fun. The truth is that it hurts, it's hard, but the reward is profound. And the reward can be your own future stories of unstoppable miracles of God's goodness and grace. I believe God is going to move in ways he has not moved before, bringing healing, restoration, and reconciliation in ways we have not seen before in this next season. This is why I believe seeing the world through a restorative justice lens is vital, because those who have eyes to see and ears to hear will join him in his work. Thank you. Whew.